A couple months ago, we made a video on the channel talking about different sounds that every producer should know and should be able to recognize. And in that video, we mostly focused on melodic elements. So a lot of synth, a lot of keys, even different bells and chromatic percussion. And that video might have been our most well-received video of the entire year so far. And so many of you in the comments wanted us to actually do that same concept, but with drums and with percussion. So that's exactly what we're gonna do today. I'm gonna show you 50 different types of drum sounds and percussion sounds that you should know, you should be able to recognize, and then implement in your own music. So we're going to dive into all of that in 1 second, but before we do, you're watching Make Pop Music. My name is Austin. We do videos like this every single Friday, so if you like this, make sure that you subscribe. Let us know in the comments down below what videos you want to see in the future. And then other than that, after the video, if you want to support our channel, head over to makepopmusic.com and check out everything we have over there. We have a ton of free stuff, and then we have sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs, and a start to finish production course. It's the best way to support the channel. It's the best way to make sure that we can do videos like this every single Friday. But other than that, let's dive in and let's take a look at different drum and percussion sounds that you should know. We're gonna start with something basic. We're gonna start with a basic drum kit. So I just have one pulled up right here in Groove Agent, and I'm gonna just kind of highlight the kit pieces so you can see them. So this big round one that sits on the floor, that's a kick drum. You're gonna play that with your foot. You might also see this referred to as a bass drum. Typically with acoustic drums, the sizes of the actual shells and how tight the actual heads on them are tuned is really what gives that drum its tone. It's what gives it the resonance. It's what gives it the actual initial bite. So every kind of acoustic drum kit will sound wildly different depending on what the shell is, how big the shell is, how hard you have them actually tuned. But other than that, you should at least know the actual drum kit pieces. So we have a kick drum, pretty self-explanatory. We have a snare drum up here. Again, these range a ton in size. If you were to hit the side of a snare drum, or really any kind of drum that has a shell, that's where you get a side stick or a rim hit. It's not a rim shot. A rim shot is when you hit the snare and you hit the rim at the same time. But if you're looking for samples and you want that kind of sound, maybe side stick, maybe rim hit. And then other than that, you have toms. The two that are mounted up here are gonna be called your rack toms, and the two that sit here on their own legs are called floor toms. They're typically arranged from highest pitch to lowest pitch, or A to, C or D, depending on how many you have, or 1 through 4. So tom A, tom 1, high tom, B, C, D. All the way down, you could have 3 toms, you could have 7 toms. They'll pretty much always kind of line up in whatever kind of pitch that they're arranged in. And then other than that, let's talk about different cymbals. So you have your hi-hat over here. A hi-hat is essentially 2 different cymbals that are kind of sandwiched on each other and left slightly open so they kind of resonate against each other. And you'll hear them played open a lot. But they also have a foot pedal, so if you want to close it, that's what gives you that little kind of like cymbal choke. And if you leave your foot on the pedal, you can play it as a closed hat. So if you're looking for samples, that's what you're gonna wanna look for hi-hats. Even if you transition that into electronic samples or trap samples or whatever, anything that kind of has that really tight, that sound is gonna be a closed hat. Anything like that is gonna be an open hat. So that's what you need to know for hats. Let's move on to cymbals. The main cymbal that you kind of will, sit on, especially in like a big rock song or something like that, is gonna be a crash. Typically, drum kits will have at least 2. You'll have a crash A and a crash B, or a left crash and a right crash. You could have as many as 3, 4. They also range in size, and typically the bigger that they get, the deeper, kind of more resonant sound that they have. And then other than that, these kind of cymbals that look a little bit inverted, those are called chinas. You hear those a lot in like metal breakdowns. You hear them a lot as like little accent hits. They have that really kind of sharp metallic-y hit. Super cool. They're almost like a little baby version of like a gong. Which we'll talk about a little bit later. Other than that, you have ride cymbals. And what's cool about a ride is there are multiple places that you can play it. So you can play the ride on the bow, you can play the ride on the bell, or you can play the ride kind of on the edge. So if you play it on the edge, that's essentially you kind of hitting that ride with your stick on the actual edge, almost like you would a crash, but much softer. If you hit that on the bell, that's what's actually right up here, right by that little bolt and nut. And that's what's gonna give you almost that little kind of like zill bell sound. And then if you just play it kind of right on the bow, that's just kind of like your typical jazzy ride sound. So that is kind of the basic pieces of an acoustic drum kit. Those also translate over to electric kits. They'll kind of have the same naming convention, they just sound drastically different. So now that we've talked about that, let's actually move on to different percussion sounds that you should know. I want to start with different world hand percussions. So we're going to kind of start with a djembe and work ourselves all the way down. A lot of these are really similar in kind of the way that they're built or the way that they're played, but being that they come from different regions of the world, they all have their own sounds, they all appear in different styles of music, and I think that this will really, really highlight that. So let's start with a djembe. This comes from Africa. It is basically just a drum that has like a skin head on it, typically like a goat skin or something like that, and they sound like this. Djembes are typically a bit bigger, they're a bit deeper, they kind of have that low kind of boom boom. You can even play them lower than this. So typically with any kind of drum that has a pitch, how you tune it or how big the drum is, like that acoustic kit that I talked about earlier, will directly translate to what notes that you're gonna play. So if you're playing something like this where you want it to have a melody, you're gonna wanna tune that drum to certain notes. So you can always do that in real life or in any kind of samples that you use. Let's move on to the next kind of hand percussion, and that is a bongo. These are typically a bit smaller. These are kind of Afro-Cuban. You hear them a lot in kind of current African music or Cuban and Caribbean music. These are a bit smaller, and they have a lot of that like slap that you're gonna be familiar with. You hear them a lot also in like funk music, like they appeared all over the Silk Sonic record. They're really cool to kind of get those kind of less resonant slappy hits, and then you kind of let those resonant hits peek in, and it sounds really nice. So there's a bongo, as you can tell, similar type of instrument to the djembe, but they sound totally different. Same thing with congas. Conga is basically a really, really, really long bongo. They sit on the floor. They're typically about like waist or belly button height. And again, they range in pitch, they range in kind of texture, but here's what a conga sounds like. So again, you're gonna play it typically the same as a bongo. If you wanna mute it, you can keep your hand down while you hold it so it doesn't resonate. Take your hand off it and give it a quick hit to resonate. But being that they are just kind of made of a different wood, or that they're a little bit bigger, or that they don't necessarily like sit in your arms or on your lap or mounted, they're mounted to the floor, they just have a totally different sound. So that's what a conga sounds like. Those are again from Cuba. Let's move on to like a tabla. This is an Indian hand percussion element. And one of the telltale signs of like a tabla, or really a lot of different Indian and Middle Eastern elements whatsoever, is that they are not so perfectly tuned like a bongo or a conga or even a djembe. They're gonna have a lot of that kind of like where they start at one pitch and then they kind of shift around. So you'll hear it here. They're really, really, really cool textural elements, especially if you can get them to fit inside of your mix. So try a tabla if you haven't already. They're one of my favorites to use if I want something that has a little bit more pizzazz than just kind of like a standard tuned kind of wooden skin drum element. Let's move on to a talking drum. These look totally different and they kind of operate a little bit differently, but they have that kind of same almost like vocal kind of formated effect that you hear from like a tabla. You've probably heard them in like The Mandalorian from Ludwig Göransson. They are just these really cool kind of like drum elements that you can add in that again have a little bit of tone and a little bit of note to them, but they have that extra pizzazz. What's cool about the talking drum is it's not fixed to one pitch like a bongo or a conga. Because the way that you kind of let it resonate will determine the pitch. So they don't have a fixed pitch, so you can really kind of play around with them, get them to sound however you want. Again, they kind of range in size, but you know, super, super cool, not used a ton. Next we have the udu. And I'm kind of pairing that with the tabla and with the talking drum because it actually looks a little bit different. It almost looks like a little vase with kind of a hole in it, and you really just kind of play that hole. It's almost like if you were to take the strings off of an acoustic guitar, and if that acoustic guitar was made out of clay and a lot smaller, and you were just slapping the sound hole. But you get that kind of like water droplet-esque, like four-minted kind of pitch shifting note to it. So similar to the talking drum, depending on how you want to hold it and depending on how you want to let it resonate, will kind of determine the tone and the pitch of it. So if you're looking for cool kind of world percussion instruments, those three are really, really fun to kind of mess around with because they have a lot of different dynamic to them. Those are some that I would actually recommend if you can get your hands on physical ones, playing them because there's just so much different character that you can get. Sometimes the sample's not going to do it for you. Let's move on to a taiko. This is basically just those big Japanese drums that you see them whacking with the mallets. They can be huge. They can be like 10 feet tall. So They're super big, super cinematic. Think of almost like a war drum. That's what you get with a taiko. Super cool, super cinematic. Next, let's move on to a timbales. So these are actually struck with mallets. We're kind of moving on to mallet elements now. Before, they were all kind of hand-played elements, but with timbales, they almost look like really, really, really little toms, typically made of like brass. And you've probably heard them a lot in like 2016, 2017 with that big timbale fill that was in pretty much every tropical pop song. That's what they sound like. Super metallic little toms, really resonant, super cool that you can add. Timbales are a really cool thing for like a fill. Then we move on to a timpani, also typically struck with a mallet. These are those big kind of orchestral drums that you're going to see in any kind of symphony or orchestra. A lot of the time, these are also tuned to whatever the orchestra is going to be playing in. Super resonant. They kind of have that like low, but also kind of weird metallic-y vibe to them. They are really, really cool. They can be a really nice addition, like under a big hit, because they can add a little bit of tone, they add a little bit of pitch, and they can add a lot of texture. Let's move on to the cajon. The cajon also comes from Cuba, similar to like the bongos, but it could not be more different. It is not a little wooden drum with a skin head. It's actually a big wooden box. If you've ever seen like acoustic sets on YouTube or even in person, and there's a person sitting on what looks like a giant milk crate, kind of slapping it, that is a cajon. They are really, really cool for any kind of like laid back acoustic element. Typically, you can get kind of a bass drum sound by whacking like a fist to it, and then you can play it more open with the palm, and that'll give you something like a snare drum. So kick, snare, you kind of play it however you want to. Really cool element. They're not too expensive. You can find those at pretty much any major music store. Let's move on to what are going to be more of kind of like shaken elements. So we have a shaker. You probably know what a shaker is. They come in different forms. Egg shakers. You have like little hourglass shakers. You could literally just go get a salt shaker, shake that. Really, it's just any kind of container that will have any kind of like grain or granule or sand in it. And it sounds like this. Super cool, super fun. I actually think that everybody should have a shaker in their own studio physically, because you can play them and you can get really cool movement with them, and they cost like $6. So if you don't have one, order a set of shakers. You can get them off literally Amazon. They don't have to be anything crazy. Another form of kind of a shaker is a maraca. It's essentially a shaker with a handle attached to it. So you've probably seen them a lot if you've taken any kind of like music class in your life. They're just shakers with a handle on it. I just have like a little one shot there. They kind of work the same way. You just shake it however you want. Nothing too crazy. Then you have a cabasa. It almost looks like a maraca, but instead of being hollow and filled with sand or a grain or something like that, it actually has like a wooden handle, and then it has a kind of wooden, I guess what would be like cylinder on top, and it'll have steel beads wrapped around that. So you can actually rub your hand on the steel beads and get kind of a sliding texture. You can shake it and almost get like this small little chain hit texture. They're pretty cool. Cabasas are a really cool accent if you have something like a shaker or a maraca happening, because they give you a little bit more oomph. So again, that's one if you like shake it. You can also rub it for kind of like they're really cool. Again, super inexpensive, something that you could probably have in your own studio. Next is castanets. If you've ever taken a music class in like elementary school in the United States, these are the things that look like little crab claws that you put on your fingers. It was what I always wanted to play in music class. Super fun, make you feel like a little crab. They're essentially just these little kind of like finger clasp, and you play them like this, and they sound like this. They're super cool. I think that they can give you a nice little bit of like, they almost sound like playing a bunch of little rim shots. And again, super inexpensive. You could probably have those in your studio. Next is a tambourine. So this is essentially those circles that have what look like a bunch of little mini hi-hats all the way around them. Sometimes they have a skin head on them. Sometimes they are just open. You can also get one of these for 20 to 40 bucks. I highly recommend every studio have at least one, if not two or three, because they come in way different pitches and textures. Here's what a tambourine sounds like. So you get those big transient hits by slapping it against your palm. So you just shake it. Again, something that I think should pretty much be live tracked if ever possible. I will never use like a tambourine sample. I use tambourine loops a ton because they were live played, but it's really, really hard to use like a tambourine one shot and get a pattern like that. It's cool to have like a tambourine accent as a one shot, but they really have to be played for you to get that kind of movement. The next, we have a triangle. We're kind of moving on to our metallic elements now. A triangle is literally just a metal triangle that you just whack with a little stick. And again, you can kind of mute the triangle by holding it, and then you can kind of let go of it a little bit and let it resonate. Typically, any kind of percussion element, the more that you deaden it, whether it's with your hand or a blanket or like on a snare drum, you can pop like a wallet or a bandana on it. The more dead you make it, the less it's going to resonate. And then if you want it to have that really tonal resonation, just have as little contact to it as possible. So with a triangle, you can hold it from a string and it'll resonate, and then you can grab it with your hand and it'll just give you that little metal tink because it has nowhere to actually go. Let's move on to another kind of metal percussion element, and that is a cowbell. These also come in different sizes and different pitches. Super cool. You've probably seen the Saturday Night Live skit about cowbells. I use them all the time, especially in like funk and disco. Also, another element that gets sampled quite a bit, and sampled cowbells can sound quite a bit different than organic ones. Similar to a cowbell, you have a wood block. It kind of looks almost identical, but it's made out of wood instead of out of metal. Also have different pitches. These are super fun to play. It almost sounds like a little metronome. A lot of metronomes are based off of wood blocks. If you can get a set of those are fun to kind of throw into any percussion arrangement. Then you have a clave. These are essentially two little sticks that you whack together. They give you that kind of tonal pitch depending on how big they are. Then you have sampled claves, which sound a bit different. It basically has the same kind of element, but then it has that kind of electronic resonance. And then you can even have sampled claves that sound like this. So they can kind of range in sound a lot, but a typical clave, two little wooden sticks, you just whack them together. Next, we're going to move on to a guiro. This is essentially a wooden element that has a bunch of ridges or ribs in it, and then you just take a stick and you can hit it, or you can glide it down the ridges and ribs. You've probably seen this in the form of like a little frog that has those little raised spines in a gift shop with a little stick that you can just kind of run the mallet down. Super cool, kind of nice to hit as a percussive element and then slide as just kind of this textural element. It almost sounds like a zipper or something like that. They're super cool. Again, you can find those at like a Rainforest Cafe gift shop. They're everywhere. Next, we have a bell tree. This is basically a little vertical stick that has a bunch of little, almost like cymbals or little chimes attached to it, and you just run a mallet down it. It almost sounds like a chime. However, it doesn't resonate nearly as much as a chime because since it's vertical, they all just kind of hit each other and then stop resonating. So it gives you that little ring and then it just stops. Where if you have chimes, they're more horizontal and they have individual chimes that hang. Run your stick all the way down them and you get that really nice washy. I love chimes. They are amazing for transitions. Next, you have a tubular bell. This is also a chime. Technically, it's just like a absolutely freaking gigantic chime. You'll also hear these referred to as church bells. They're essentially just those giant bells in a bell tower, sound like this. Kind of iconic, works great for Christmas music, which is coming right up. Next, you have a gong, basically a traditional Chinese element. Massive, massive cymbal, typically between like 2 feet and 7 feet big. You just strike it with a gigantic mallet. There's really nothing else that sounds like it. So if you want a gong, they can be absolutely cinematic, but they have to fit in the right place. Otherwise, you're going to immediately be like, why did they just stick a gong there? Other than that, we have steel drums. So these are, you see them a lot in the Caribbean. They're those little steel drums that have little divots that you hit with a little mallet. You probably saw Michael Scott play one when he came back from Jamaica in The Office.
Feeling hot, hot, hot. Feeling hot, hot, hot.
This is what they sound like. It's essentially a gigantic steel bowl that has these tiny steel bowls kind of carved out of it. Gives you these cool pitches, these cool resonances. And then similar to that, you have a hand pan, which looks similar. They're typically just a different size, and you play them with your hand instead of a mallet. It just gives you a totally different texture. Much softer, much more resonant. Really, really cool element. I love hand pans. They're super fun. Next, let's talk about different drum samples. I think the only thing that I really want to say for this section is when you're looking for drum samples, if you can identify the actual percussion element that it is, whether that's going to be an acoustic sample or a super processed electric sample, that will get you a long way. And then other than that, most samples now are sorted by like style or by artists that they're inspired by. Or if you go on like our website, they all kind of say what they're inspired by. If you go on Splice, you can sort by genre. But I just want to kind of show you how different they range. So here's kind of like an EDM-y kick from our Dark Pop Volume 2 pack. So that's a kick. Here's a hip hop kick. That's more like a kind of stompy MPC style kick. Here's just like a soft, kind of bumpy trap kick. And then here is kind of a retro Lindrum, which we'll talk about in a second, inspired kick. Those are all kick drums. They just sound way different. So if you can know the genre, or what we're going to talk about in just a second, the actual drum machine that they're inspired by, and you can search it by that, I think that helps out a lot. Same thing with snares. You have like a little retro Lindrum snare. You have like a process, like almost 808 snare that's just a little bit more modern. You have like an indie snare that would probably come from something more like the EMU SP21, and then you have an EDM snare, which comes from something like a 909 or any other kind of like late 90s drum machine. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the drum machines, because I want to spend some time on that. Let's go ahead and let's start with probably the most iconic. I'm going to start with the Lindrum. You've heard this a million times. This was from like 82, and you heard it in pretty much every 80s pop record. Madonna, Aha, Michael Jackson. Now you hear it all the time in like The Weeknd, the Troye Sivan record. You're going to hear it in like Stay by the Kid Laroi. Sounds like this. You should recognize that really mid-heavy kick, that really dry, punchy snare, and then those kind of weird resonant goo, goo, goo toms. That's how you know it's a Lindrum. So if you're looking for a sample that fits that kind of synthwave, 1980s meets like modern kind of Weeknd, Kid Laroi, it's probably going to be a Lindrum or some modified version of a Lindrum. So that's a good place to start if you want those kind of sounds. Let's move on to a DMX next, because that's probably the most similar. An Oberheim DMX, also a drum machine, which is actually from 1980, so a couple years earlier, and it has a lot of the same kind of texture. It's going to be pretty dry, pretty mid-forward, but there's a couple different elements that'll make you know that it's a DMX over a Lindrum. Take a listen. To me, it sounds a little bit more organic and acoustic than the Lindrum. So it kind of has that really dry mid-punchy kick, and then it has that really dry slappy snare. But to me, they don't sound as bright, they don't sound as processed, and the snares to me is the biggest giveaway. They still have that resonant kind of goo, but it's not nearly as electronic. Let me play the exact same pattern on the Lindrum and then on the DMX, so you can hear that they kind of feel like they're from the same family, but the Lindrum is going to be more processed, the DMX is going to be a little bit more organic. Now let's listen to the DMX. Both work really, really great for kind of 80s inspired pop music. That's what everybody in the 80s was using, was pretty much one of those. And then the last little kind of pop driven 80s drum machine that you want to know is the Simmons ST8, or even like the SC7 that they had also. Here's what it sounds like. So you can almost think of this as like those like Miami Vice-esque synthwave drums. It's where the kick, the snare, and all the toms have that really weird kind of resonant tom frequency. I actually find that like the Simmons SE8 snare drum makes a really cool layer like under the Lindrum or something like that. But to me, I find these hard to use by themselves. But if you're looking for that thing where every part of the kit almost sounds like a tom, it's probably the Simmons. Let's move on to the 808, actually. This is probably the most iconic hip-hop drum of all time. This is from Roland. This actually came out in 1980, and this is what kind of gave us the colloquialism 808, which we now kind of just adopted for any kind of sustained sub bass. But the 808 had an original kick drum, and that kick drum had a really long decay, which is why we call anything with kind of a long decay sub an 808. But pay attention to the snare, pay attention to the clap, and pay attention to the hi-hats, because you're going to immediately realize that these 808 samples have just been used and used and recycled and recycled and processed a billion times since 1980. Literally every single one of those sounds is iconic, and I could go on Splice right now to any trap pack on the market, whether it's whoever, it doesn't even matter. And they're gonna have those exact samples in there, all just sampled right out of an 808. Granted, a lot of the time now they get processed, they get mixed, they get saturated, whatever. But the 808, iconic drum sounds, you have to know them. If you hear that sound immediately, it is the 808. Let's move on to the 909 next. That was their next iteration in 1983, also by Roland. This one sounds totally different, but you'll equally recognize these sounds as well. Let me play it. So you can recognize that clap immediately. You can recognize that kind of snare and that really kind of like zappy kick. You hear these a ton in electronic music and house music and garage music and any kind of like 80s and 90s techno. If there was a pop song that wanted more kind of electronic or sample drums in the 80s, it was probably going with something like the 909. So, I mean, you can kind of listen to how different the 808 and the 909 sound versus the 909. So if you go listen to any kind of electronic housey record that's on the radio right now, it's probably got a clap, a hi-hat, and that snare from the 909 in some way, shape, or form. Even if it's kind of a modern process sample, that's probably what it was based off of. The next thing that we'll talk about is the EMU SP12, just because I wanted to throw in something where the drum samples are totally different. These are not super electronic at all. It almost sounds like somebody just recorded a really roomy drum kit. So there's a couple different preset banks on there. I kind of showed you both. This one, super iconic for that kind of 80s gated sound. And then you have a more electronic version of that. Used a ton. You'd probably hear it in something like a Genesis record or something like that. Other than that, there's a ton of other drum machines. You have all the kind of Akai and PC stuff that came out in the 90s. You have other Rolands that have come out since then, other Simmons that have come out since then. But those are really iconic ones that you should know because most sounds that you're going to hear nowadays are based off of one of those 5 or 6. So with that said, let's move on to the last little thing that I want to talk about. And that is just extra little information about drums. So you might hear the term gated drum a lot. So gated toms, gated snares. Think of, for gated toms, like the In the Air Tonight drum fill by Phil Collins, that goo 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 goo, where it kind of has this weird roomy sound that doesn't decay. And when you think of snares, think of like a 1975 record where they play that snare drum, or like a Genesis record where they play the snare drum, and it has a lot of that reverb but also doesn't decay. So we're going to start with a snare drum that sounds like this. And then what you want to do is you can essentially make any sample a gated snare or a gated tom or whatever by just adding kind of a room sample. I'm going to go pretty heavy with this. And then what you want to do is you want to add something called a gate, and you can mess around with the threshold parameter and the release parameter. And what that's going to do is once the volume gets below a certain level, it's going to kill that completely. So instead of it decaying, it still gives you all the texture and width of that reverb, but it's going to stop once this gets below 17.5 dB. If I loosen this up. So I liked it where it was at 17.5 dB. I'd probably print that sample and just go from there. That's how you make any drum a gated drum. Super, super common with like indie pop, super common with 80s pop. Really, really cool element to have. The next thing that I want to talk about that you might hear referred to when you talk about drums or percussion are break beats. So these are essentially, they kind of come from electronic music in the 80s and 90s that would listen to soul and funk records and disco records of like the 60s and 70s. And any part where the drummer would have a little kind of drum solo or a little, break from the rest of the instruments, they would just play. And then those records would kind of sample that. So you hear drum breaks or break beats kind of referred to as this. There is like the Amen break, which is probably the most iconic break of all time, but you get them a lot in kind of like that 90s. You hear them a lot in like drum and bass, garage music, house music, but you could use a break beat in pop music. It's essentially just sampling any kind of old, 70s soul, funk, disco record and using that in a current production. Other than that, you have drum fills, not to be confused with a break beat. This is essentially just a transition for the drummer to move from section to section. So a lot of the time they're played on toms, they're played on kicks and snares. It really is just going to take you from one section to the other. So if you're looking for, I'm going from the verse to a pre-chorus and it feels a little bit weird, throw in a little drum fill. It might help out a lot. And then the last little thing that I want to talk about is a top loop. This is a more modern term, but these are essentially any kind of loops that have a combination of snares, claps, hi-hats, cymbals, and extra little percussion, but they don't have a kick. And a lot of the time, they don't even really have like a main snare. They'll just kind of have a snare accent or layer. And these are really, really good to just throw on top of a basic kick and snare pattern that you have because it gives it a lot of movement and a lot of texture. Here's one that I pulled from Sweet Tooth. If you want a pack of a ton of different top loops, go check out Sweet Tooth. We just released it a couple weeks ago. It might be my favorite pack we've ever done. It is absolutely insane. But here's an example. And the reason it's called a top loop is because obviously you're just going to drag that on top of your drum or percussion arrangement, and it just adds a bit of sauce. So that is everything that I want to talk about for this video. I think we dove into a lot. It doesn't even begin to cover all of the different types of drums, types of percussion, ways that you could kind of manipulate a drum kit, but hopefully this gives you a better understanding of some of the basic sounds, where to look for them, how to name them, where to find them, how to kind of turn them into your own sample. So hopefully this helped. Let me know if it did in the comments down below. If there's anything that you think that I missed in this video, make sure that you let us know down below as well so people can just refer to the comments. Other than that, if you like this video, make sure you like and subscribe. That really helps out our channel a ton. You guys have no idea that the more you interact with the video, the better this video does, and the more people that can see it and get some help from it. So we really, really appreciate it. Other than that, if you want to subscribe, we'll be back next Friday and every Friday after that with more content. And if you want to support us, you can head over to makepopmusic.com. We have our own sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs, that production course I talked about. Go check all that out. That's at makepopmusic.com. But that is going to do it for this video. I'll see you guys soon with more content. Much love, everyone. Peace.